record. All right. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Shanika Peck. I'm a Director of Career Programs over at Foundations, Inc. And welcome to our Beyond the Conference webinar series. So today we have our one and only Yana List from Foundations, and we'll be getting started shortly. But before we do, I want to give you a little background information on Foundations, Inc. We are a national education nonprofit located in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. And our mission is to improve the quality of education by building the skills of educators. We work across the school day with after-school programs, school districts, states to create a brighter future for every child every day. Now, if you're interested in learning more about Foundations, you can follow us on social media, and I'll drop a few links and our social media information into the chat. You may already know us for our signature professional learning experience, the Beyond School Hours Conference, which is held each year in February. In 2025, we will be in Orlando, Florida from February 13th to the 16th, and we would love for you all to be our guests. Registration should be launching pretty soon, so be on the lookout for that. And I'm going to go ahead and drop the link to our Beyond School Hours Conference site into the chat, along with our social media tags. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and hand things over to today's facilitator, Yana Liss.
Hey, Shanika, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm so excited to be talking about this session, Change Your Questions, Change Their World, because one of the things we know is the way that educators ask questions and engage in questioning strategies with young people is one of the most impactful things that we do throughout the day in the ways that we interact with them. So with that in mind, I do want to introduce myself. My name is Yana List. I'm an education specialist at Foundations. I've been with Foundations for 4.5 years. I come from a background of school day, after school, and summer educator, project director, and I have master's degrees in both curriculum development and statistics. So a lot of what I like to think about is quantifying the ways in which we can improve outcomes for our young people. So today we are going to talk about the types of questions. We're going to talk about how to write effective questions to probe understanding and extend student learning. And well, we're not going to get to the checklist if we're being honest. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is an activity we're calling the question pile. Because we are a small group, I am just going to ask us to work as a whole group so we don't have to kind of spend the time to break out into rooms. So I'll just have us in a series of groups. So here is Jamboard. Here we go. And so the activity that we're going to be doing is I would love for us to make a list of all the questions, excuse me, that you have asked either your students or your staff in the last week. So it can be any kind of question. So if you've asked them about the content, even if you've asked them about their day, just taking the time to find to just make a list of all the questions you've asked. And you can do this by clicking on the T to the left of the screen to add your own comments of the questions that you have asked. If you're having trouble navigating the Jamboard by clicking that link, you can also pop yours into the chat box and we can add them to our sticky notes. So whatever you prefer works for us. And I see our sticky note is kind of getting bounced around. But sort of thinking about the kinds of questions you've asked. And so one of the questions I asked today is I was meeting with a coworker about a marketing topic, and I asked her, why do we need this data? Uh-oh, where did my comment go? And so that was a question that I asked today. So we've got some others so far. Did you meet with this student about their college choices? How did you get that answer? Let's see if we're getting any other answers. How can we improve? What can we do better? How did we do this year? You good? Did you get our text or email message? How are you? Let's take another minute to fill in some of those answers before we get back to our presentation. Can I help with that? What was your favorite part of the day? Is there anything I can do to help you or make you feel better? It's a good one. Thinking about how we serve our kids is not just academic, it is also about that social emotional and the connections we form. All right, thank you everyone for sharing those ideas. So we have got a whole list of questions that you have all asked in the last week. Fantastic. So let's think about the purpose of questions. And so when we're talking about questions, there's really two categories of questions that we can generally define. And those are both their lower order and higher order questions. So let's start with lower order questions. These are questions that we ask in order to evaluate student understanding, comprehension skills. We can also use them to identify students' strengths and weaknesses, to really hone in on the learning, oftentimes that has just been done, and to make sure that students have demonstrated mastery of the content. So lower order questions are those that are very focused on the task that you've already done. And those can be contrasted with higher order questions. And higher order questions are those that really take the time to probe student understanding and move past just that understanding to engage in deeper and critical thinking. So, really making students share their own thinking, process, make connections, do problem solving. And I do want to say that those lower order thinking questions are typically recall, and higher order thinking questions are often defined as those that require deeper learning. So it is not the case that you should only be asking higher order thinking questions. In fact, you need both types of questions for effective instruction. We do need to know that students have learned appropriate facts, that students know how to follow the steps of a problem. So those are things that we definitely need to know. But when we're talking about higher order and lower order, what we're really talking about is the cognitive load. So how much brain power, in particular, how many neurons students have to activate in order to answer these types of questions effectively. It is absolutely not the case that you should only ask higher order questions. You definitely need both. But when we're talking about these higher order and lower order questions, we want to define some examples of them. And in addition to that higher or lower order, so thinking about how much cognitive load we have to do, lower order questions are much more focused on recall, basic comprehension skills. Higher order is about critical thinking, problem solving, creative thinking. We also have open-ended and close-ended questions. Open-ended questions are those that don't have one correct answer or don't give students limitations on how to answer a question. That is where students have to construct their own answer. It's not like a multiple choice question where there's a set of answers they can choose from. A close-ended question is one where there is really one correct defined answer. On an assessment, it might be a multiple choice question. Those really are much more limited. And so let's look at some examples and really define how these questions are different. Let's start by looking at some of these lower order questions. And so let's look at an open-ended lower order question. An example of that is, what are the stages of cell division? Anyone know those? Prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, cytokinesis. Okay, that's my former biology teacher hat. But that would be an example of an open-ended question, because while there are the four correct stages and then cell division, there are different ways students can explain those. The titles are the same, but they might use different ways of explaining what happens during each stage of cell division. Now, an example of a close-ended question is, what is an example of an adjective? The response to that is generally going to be a one-word answer. Maybe students have three examples, but it's really a one-word answer. It is not an answer that encourages elaboration and detail from your students. So when we ask those type of close-ended questions, we're going to end up with students talking a lot less. And one of the interesting things I want to highlight for you is that there have been studies of how many kinds of questions teachers ask. And one study found that 87% of questions that educators ask their students are close-ended. So the majority of questions that students are being asked during the school day have one answer. They don't require elaboration. They're not giving students a really detailed opportunity to speak and think. Now let's look at some examples of higher order thinking questions, which can also look like they're open-ended or close-ended. Now, an example of an open-ended higher order thinking question is, given the information you have, would you say this is a duck or a goose? So just as an example, you might have read some descriptions of the characteristics of an animal, and you have to say, I think it's a duck or a goose. But this question invites elaboration. The student will have to justify their answer. A one-word answer is not going to cut it. Whereas with a close-ended question here, the example is, can we solve the energy crisis? That's going to be a yes or no answer. Now, a detailed, open-ended question like, what are some possible solutions to the energy crisis? That would be open-ended. That would involve a lot of elaboration from the student. But can we solve the energy crisis? That's just going to be a one-word answer. You're not going to get a lot from students. So the first thing I want to highlight is the importance of really focusing on asking open-ended questions. Asking questions that invite the student to think and speak. We as educators, we want to talk less and listen more. We want to make sure that we are giving students as many opportunities as possible to think about and to share with us what they're thinking. So I would like to do a fun activity for just a moment. And we are going to go back and look at the list of questions that you all generated earlier. And I'd like us to take a moment to mark these. Are they open-ended or close-ended? And are they lower order or higher order thinking questions? So we're going to go back to our Jamboard, and you have the link in the chat box if you want to open it on your own. And so we can take a look at this set of questions that you all wrote together a little bit earlier. So let's take a look at some of these. So here is the first question. Did you meet with the student about their college choices? I'm wondering, and you can either mark this on the screen or let us know in the chat box, would you give us an example? Would you let us know, excuse me, is this an open-ended or a close-ended question? And actually, if you prefer to unmute yourself, feel free to do that. Yes, it is definitely a close-ended question. It is a question that has a yes or no answer. It's not encouraging a lot of speaking from, well, in this case, a staff member. And do you think that this is a question that involves higher order or lower order thinking? So is it just about recall, or is it a question that encourages the student or the staff member in this case, to think deeply and to problem solve? So is this higher order or lower order? Yes, it is definitely a lower order thinking question. Once again, I want to emphasize, it is not the case that we should only be asking higher order thinking questions. We need lower order thinking questions too. It's just a matter of it requires less brain and less processing power. Because this is something that you're probably going to want to know, especially if you're talking to a staff member who's a career counselor, just as an example. There is very likely to be a follow-up question to this, but this question in itself would be an example of a lower order close-ended question. Let's look at another one. Why do we need this data? Would you describe this as an open-ended or a close-ended question? It is definitely an open-ended question. There is not going to be only one correct answer. There are many possible reasons that you could need a piece of data. Is this an example of a higher order or a lower order thinking question? It is definitely an example of our higher order thinking question, because this is going to encourage justification. It's not just about recall, it's about showing, understanding, problem solving, identifying causes. So let's take a look at, here's another one. How did you get that answer? Is this an example of an open-ended or a close-ended question? So is this open-ended or close-ended? Yes, it is definitely an open-ended question. There is more than one correct answer. There are a lot of ways to answer this, to explain what the student did. So if this is, for example, a math question, is very likely where you will see this. And how did you get that answer? Do you think that would be an example of a lower order or a higher order question? So we are getting a couple of answers that this is a higher order thinking question. So this is a trick, and this is a little more tricky. This would likely be an example of a lower order thinking question, and we are going to go into the details and look at some examples of questioning so that we can really differentiate between those, because um, there are going to be some differences in definitions depending on the context where you are asking this question. But this would generally be an example of a lower order thinking question because, again, remember, lower order thinking questions are about recall and understanding. So that would be a student walking you through the steps that they followed. Again, it does, just because it's a lower order thinking question doesn't mean it's a question we shouldn't ask. A lot of lower order thinking questions are absolutely essential. And so we need to ask both kinds of questions. They are going to all come up in different contexts and work together. But those close-ended questions often close off the conversation. They're limited, but open-ended questions encourage more speaking, more discussing from the student. And those lower order thinking questions are about showing understanding, recall. Higher order thinking questions about problem solving, about extending the learning is often what we see in those higher order thinking questions. So with that in mind, I would love for us to move back to our PowerPoint. Here we go. To talk about the types of questions that we see from students, or that we can ask our students. Also ask adults, but as educators, we are going to focus on the questions that we ask. We're going to ask our young people. And the blue line that you see in the middle is the really point where we break up and split between lower order and higher order thinking questions. And we're going to slide by slide go through each of these types of questions. We're going to look at some examples so that you are really able to establish and develop an understanding of the different kinds of questions and what they are and what they mean. So let's dive right in. So remember level questions are those questions that are about recognizing, recalling just facts. These are the questions that are just focused on, do you remember? Do you know the facts in this case? All of these terms come from the Bloom's taxonomy. That might be something a lot of you are familiar with. It might be something you're not familiar with. If it's something you're not familiar with, don't worry. We're going to be going over it in detail today. If you are familiar with it, it'll hopefully be a nice reminder, a nice review. So some examples of remember questions. Describe what happens when. What do you remember about? What is? So each of these would result in the kind of response. Describe what happens when I combine the colors blue and red. The response to that would be, I get some shade of purple, depending on how much blue and how much red. That is actually an open-ended question, and it does encourage some elaboration, but it's not going to use a whole lot of higher order thinking skills because it's really just a fact-based question. What do you remember about? Okay, we took notes yesterday. What can you recall? That's valuable, that's important. We want to check in on what students are retaining, but it is another example of a lower order thinking question. I always want to emphasize, just because it's called a lower order thinking question doesn't mean it's not important. We have to ask all types of questions. So our lowest level of questions is remember. These are just factual recollection. The kinds of verbs involved in understanding are where we ask students to interpret, to summarize, to classify, make inferences. So that's a kind of prediction that could include comparing, and it could include explaining. So for example, can you explain the steps you took to solve this math problem? We saw that question earlier. That is a very valuable question to ask your students. It is an open-ended question, but it is a lower order thinking question. It's not taking them beyond what they have already done. But of course, we do need to check in. Lower order doesn't mean those are questions that we skip. Some other examples of the types of questions you could ask at the understand level, so that second level of the Bloom's taxonomy. How would you compare and contrast two things? How would you compare and contrast a duck and a goose as an example? That would be a really interesting activity for students to do, especially, second or third grade students, compare and contrasting. Well, they both have wings, they have different length necks, just as an example. What is the main idea of the story of the paragraph? Again, that is showing a student's comprehension of the text. What would happen if I added some, I don't know, more blue to this shade of purple? That would encourage the student to stop and think, well, the more blue it is, the more the shade of purple will start to look like bluish purple. So that requires understanding of colors. That might be a question you ask, your kindergarten, first grade students. But again, it is at that understanding level. Do they demonstrate an understanding of what happens when you put blue and red together? Now, the next level of Bloom's taxonomy, and this is the last of the lower order thinking questions, is apply. Apply is where we implement, we execute. So you have done some thinking. How would you solve a new problem? Can you explain to me why this process works? How would you develop a new solution? So this is where we take the content that we've learned, the student has demonstrated understanding, and we apply it in a new way. Again, lower order doesn't mean bad. It just is referring to the amount of cognitive load. So thinking about this type of question of, can you apply this process in a new way? Okay, you've learned about different types of filtration. Can you apply the different filtration techniques for a new mixture? That might be a question in a chemistry context, just as an example. So we have talked about all those lower order thinking questions. Now it is about time for us to get to those higher order thinking questions. And the first of the higher order thinking questions that I'm going to touch on is analyze. Now, analyze is where we go through and think deeply about content, about information, about anything that you're discussing. That is where you might have to differentiate between two objects. You might have to organize your thoughts and attribute. So how does one thing connect to the next? Now, I want to point out to you very specifically that we are setting out these levels of questions. Obviously, nothing is quite this regimented. A lot of questions could be touching at different levels at the same time. So we are giving a taxonomy of these kinds of questions, but not every question will smoothly fit into one layer or the next. So there is a lot of flexibility, but I'm just walking you through the distinct steps, but obviously the reality is going to be much more integrated. Some examples of the kinds of questions you might ask for analyze are, what are the advantages and disadvantages of, let's think of using grouping to solve addition problems. What are the advantages and disadvantages of I keep on thinking, oh, what were the advantages and disadvantages of this journey that the character took? So I'm just thinking, for some reason, Lord of the Rings is popping into my head. So, what were the advantages and the disadvantages of the fellowship splitting up into different groups with different missions? So, and you can do rich analysis of movies and books. So, that's just why that popped into my head. But so, students have to analyze, okay, what happened? Were the consequences? What were some of the benefits? And there were obviously drawbacks. What ideas support this? So if your student has told you the main idea of this story is the hero's journey, you follow up by asking what ideas support this, or what evidence do you have to explain your answer, to justify your answer. So reflecting on learning, moving much more deeply into the content, into the topic. Sorry about that. Now, next up, we have two levels that are evaluate and create. I just want to flag for you that different versions of Bloom's taxonomy will have one on top of the other. Some will just have them split as requiring similar levels of cognitive load. So these are the most advanced skills, but keep in mind that when we're saying cognitive load, that's like how much brain power a student needs to use to answer a question. The kinds of questions that might come up in evaluate. How would you improve? So you've looked over this this procedure for a biology experiment. How would you improve this procedure the next time? This is asking the student to move past whatever the learning they have already done, to really think critically and to analyze. What alternative would you suggest? So what, really thinking past what you've already been given, what are some other methods? And what is your predicted outcome? So doing prediction of, okay, you have all this evidence, what do you think it means? And finally, we have create. Create is where students make something new that did not exist before. They generate, they ideate, they plan, they produce. You're asking them to share their opinion. You're asking them to create their own procedure for a science experiment. You're asking them to make choices. This type of question really will result in something new that did not exist before. This often is the starting point, the types of questions we ask when students are asked to write a 5-paragraph essay. Using evidence is going to be really critical here, but they are coming up with something new. All these other earlier questions, especially those lower order thinking questions, were very directly tied to whatever was taught. And it's really about finding out, does the student actually understand the content they were taught? In these higher order thinking questions, especially in evaluate and especially in create, we are asking students to think about and create something that is new, to really generate ideas. So let's look at an example. Let's just work on an example as a group. So let's look at a case of elementary math where your group of students, whether you're working in a small group or you're working with a whole class, if you're working in out of school time, maybe you are doing some tutoring. You have a group of students that is learning about adding and subtracting fractions. I would love to hear from you in the chat box. What are some open-ended questions you can ask? And what I would love for you to do is let us know what level of question you are using and write that question. So, for example, if I wanted to ask an understanding question, I might ask the student, can you show me your procedure for solving 1/2 plus 1/4? That would be an example of an understanding question because a student has to demonstrate mastery of the fact that we have to have the same denominator. So the student would first have to change the denominator of 1/2 by multiplying it by 2, and then show that they know how to do addition. So that would be an example of a remember type question. But I would love to know or hear in the chat box, do you have some ideas for other types of questions that students could ask, that you could ask the students? And that could be at any level. It could be a remember question. So it could be an analyze question. Remember, analyze is about students being able to break it down and explain. It could be an a new evaluate question. So thinking about what has been easy, what is difficult, how does this connect to other concepts? It could be a create question. Can you create something new from this? All of those types of questions are welcome. So take a moment to think about the kinds of questions you might ask. And then we would love to hear from you in the chat box, or if you prefer to unmute yourself, that would be wonderful as well. As an example of create, maybe you want to ask a student, what is an equivalent fraction? So you could ask them to create a new kind of fraction that means the same thing. So 1/4, an equivalent fraction is 10/40. So even though those numbers are different, it means the same thing. Just as an example. I'd love to hear from everyone in the chat box if you have anything that you would like to share. Alrighty. So having a pretty quiet chat box today. That happens. I understand. But I would love to take, here we go. We've got a long answer. So you could ask them to give hands-on materials and manipulate. How would you be able to add these two fractions? Can you show me how these two fractions can be added together? So that would be an example of a comprehension question. Do you actually understand this? What steps did you take to bring the two together? Can you show me how that works? You could ask students to show you the same kind of problem, but use manipulatives to solve this problem. That's great. Manipulatives are a really great tool for getting students to think creatively about the information. So really getting students to think deeply about the content and really connect the content to that tactile experience. So thank you, Peggy, for sharing. And I believe we have, can you create a fraction problem using the same operation, but different fractions? That's a great one. So can they apply the same procedure? Can they apply the adding fractions with different denominators to a new set of fractions? Wonderful. For create, can we ask students how to answer would change if one of those numbers changed? For example, instead of 1/4, we could change it to 1/2 plus 3/4. Great. So that is an example. That would probably be more of an apply question. So can you apply the same strategy to a different number? But like I mentioned before, we lay out this taxonomy of these levels are super different, but in reality, everything is a little more, you might use the word squishy, that a lot of these questions have some overlap of different levels. But again, that is taking the time to have students think deeply and apply this procedure in a new environment. So thank you everyone that shared some of those examples. Now, the thing I want to highlight, we're going to be doing some workshopping in just a moment, is the thing to know about writing effective questions is that your effective questions are usually open-ended. Those are the kinds of questions where, like we discussed earlier, you're not closing it off to a yes or no answer. Of course, sometimes you have to ask them, did you meet with the student about their college choices? But if it starts with a closed-ended question, you definitely want to follow up with an open-ended question. Giving the students the time to share. The questions that you write should be responsive to student needs. So if a student is not able to demonstrate comprehension, so if a student doesn't understand that you have to change the denominator, so the two fractions, in order to add those two fractions, 1/2 plus 1/4 together, then moving on to apply and create is not going to make sense because the student doesn't have that fundamental understanding yet. So you need to hear the student demonstrate that understanding before you move on to those higher order thinking questions. And most importantly, and I think this is most importantly in any of our interactions with our young people, students talk most. We need our students to be the focus of conversation. We want to listen because the more students talk, the more we can develop an understanding of what they know and what gaps may exist in their understanding. So we need to make sure that we are giving our students the space to talk. And the benefit to you as an educator is you have to talk less. And I can tell you, I sit here and do this webinar. I love doing them, of course, but talking for an hour takes a lot of energy and, my throat gets dry, just as an example. So if students are talking the most, you have to do a lot less talking yourself. So what you can do, again, this most powerful piece is change the way you ask those questions to give space for students to talk. If 87% of the questions that students hear are closed-ended, in out of school time, we are in a position to change that trend, to focus on giving students the space and the time to talk, to think deeply about content, and to share with us. So what we're going to do is we are going to do a little bit of a question writing workshop. And in this workshop, what we're going to do is you are going to read over some scenario cards or some questions, and you are going to write your own questions. Now, what I'm going to do, there's 22 of us in this room, so we're going to split into two groups. You are going to be working with a tool that is called, I believe it's called Scripting Open-Ended Questions, and I believe Shanika, our host, is going to share it in the chat box. Oopsie. Scripted open-ended questions. Okay. So you are going to be using this tool that Shanika is going to share in the chat box. And you are going to come up with some ideas of questions. So as a group, you'll select one activity that you do with students that you work with. So we worked at as an example on 1/2 + 1/4. You could come up with another math activity. You could come up with a literacy activity, any kind of activity. It can just be a short idea. And in your small group, you're going to create some questions at each level. Now, in the example activity, I have provided you a list of sample questions so you have a reference for what those questions can look like. And on the second page of the handout, you have a brief layout of Bloom's taxonomy. And this takes you through those levels that we have already talked about. And it gives you some example verbs that might pop up or might be relevant at that level. And on the next page, there's even more. I provide you with even more verbs, even more kinds of actions that students can take at each of these levels. So what kinds of questions can students answer at the knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation levels? So in a moment, you are going to break up into two small groups. And I would love for you to unmute yourselves in the small group and to come up with one shared activity. It could be as simple as our kids are working on this addition problem, our kids are reading this short story, our kids are building a Lego model, whatever you want to do. And come up with some high quality open-ended questions at each level. So we're going to break up and you're going to have a 10-ish minutes, a little bit, it'll probably be more like 8 minutes in your small group to come up with some activities. You have all had this handout shared with you, and so take some time to chat. So Shanika, I think we're ready to split into our groups.
All right, rooms are all open. Sorry about that. You can rejoin your room. Rejoin your room. Sorry about that. My apologies. Rooms are
Okay,
still open.
okay, so you were saying you were thinking of what?
Literature, but are we in our group yet? I don't think so.
Do you see your breakout room sign? Like join your breakout room in the corner of your screen?
No, no, but aren't we together in a breakout?
Yeah, you are. You're returning back to your room. It closed for some reason.
Oh. It's under, you hit more, and then you
Yes,
hit join breakout room. There it is.
yes.
Okay.
We're in breakout room. Are you still there?
Yeah, but I think we're back in our main rooms now. I mean,
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, okay, I'll mute.
Yana, you're on mute.
Thank you. I appreciate the hint. I would love to hear if anyone would like to share one or two examples of the kinds of the questions that you came up with. I'd love to hear your question and what level on that Bloom's taxonomy that question aligns with. And if you prefer to let us know in the chat box, that's great too. But I think it would be lovely if we could hear someone's voice that's not mine. I want to talk less.
Well, my group didn't get to move on or create kind of questions so much, but we started with, instead of the math problem, we changed the topic to like flowers. Like, do you understand how, if they were reading a book about flowers?
Mhm.
So I guess a quick question I could probably ask is, because we were also focusing on elementary children. So maybe like, how many flowers can you recognize? Like recalling any other flowers, or even if they read the process of the book after and be like, do you remember the steps? Do you remember how they pop out, or stuff like that?
Yep. So those are examples of remembering and understanding. So do they understand how taxonomies work for identifying the species of flower? Awesome. Are there any other examples somebody would like to share? Peggy, I think you've unmuted yourself.
Yes, we were in the same group. We also were, well, as you said, we were cut off, but we were also thinking of how many flower parts can you label as far as a knowledge question. And then the comprehensive would be how did the pictures help you to remember to classify these parts?
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Thank you everyone for participating in that activity. I hope you had a chance to download the handout. I believe in the chat box, Shanika is also sharing with you all the feedback form. We would love for you to take just a minute from the to let us know how I did, give us feedback so that we can continue to create high quality webinars for you. Please also, I would love to hear from you. My email address is ylist@foundationsinc.org. And we are always available to support you. And I hope we'll see you at future webinars. And Shanika, thanks for hosting this webinar for us today.
Thank you so much, Yana. There were a lot of great strategies for asking questions. And I do want to remind everyone that a certificate of attendance will be sent within a week to all of you who attended live. We will have another session, so be on the lookout. Again, follow us on social media. We usually put out some information on our upcoming webinars there, as well as send emails. Again, if you haven't already done so, please click on our feedback form link in the chat. I'll drop it in the chat once again. Fill that out for us. We greatly appreciate your feedback. Other than that, thank you all for participating and joining us today. I'll go ahead and give everyone just another minute or so to click on that feedback form. And I'll also add a link to our conference site so that you are up to date on when you can register.
Yes, it's finally open. And Shanika, I am so excited.
Me too.
I might be a little bit biased, but I do think it's like the best conference of the year. And I'm excited to see many of you in Orlando next year in February.
Lovely. All right. Again, thank you, everyone.